Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Hi, everyone. Dr. Clark here again. And we're going to start lecturing on energy and matter. So, we left off talking about principles of science and kind of how the scientific method works. Now we're going to dive into a little bit of chemistry, a little bit of the processes by which autotrophs, like plants, green plants, some types of bacteria, the process by which they convert sunlight into chemical energy, usable energy. And then we're going to dive in just a little bit into how organisms consume those organisms, so heterotrophs, eating plants or eating animals that ate plants, how do they convert that stored energy, that chemical energy, into usable energy to do movement and things like that. We're going to talk about those processes. We're going to talk about that energy flow or that energy cycle. Okay, so before we get into that, this quote from Galileo: "The sun, with all those planets revolving around it and depending on it, can still ripen a bunch of grapes as if it had nothing else in the universe to do." All right, so even early on, people have realized how important sunlight is. It wasn't, though, until I guess, the 1600s, 1700s, and then into the 1800s that we started to develop the knowledge of how that sunlight, how those photons, how do they get converted into energy? I mean, Galileo knew that the sun was ripening the grapes, but how? That's what we're going to dive into in a little bit. Okay? So, first, I want to ask everyone this question. This is a question that has been asked to numerous people in the world today. Okay? What makes up the majority of the mass or the weight, okay, of this object, okay, this log, this chunk of wood? What makes up the majority of this mass of this item? Okay. Now, keep in mind, it might differ if it's wet versus dry. So, what makes up the majority of this mass of this item when it's wet? What makes up the majority of the mass of this item when it's dry? Okay? So you can pose it that way if you like. Maybe that doesn't change the answer. Maybe it's the same no matter what. But think about it that way. Okay? So that's the question. Now, like I said, it's been posed to a lot of individuals. Elementary school kids, high school kids, college students, even students that graduated from Harvard with a science degree were asked this question. So I'm going to provide you their data, their answers. So this is the answers from Harvard science graduates. Okay. So what did the science grads say? 75% of people, when they were asked, said water. 15% said carbon. And 10% said minerals from the soil. And so they said it was just a variety of minerals. All right. We're going to approach the answer to this question, because many of you may not actually know the answer to this question, although you utilize things like this every single day. Either you live in a building that's made of this material, you might burn this material for a source of heat, you might be writing with something that's made of this material, sitting in something that's made of this material. You're writing on something that is made of this material. Yet, most of us don't know what actually makes up this item, this simple natural resource that we call wood. All right, so that brings us to the growth of plants. That brings us to this idea of plant growth, or what's going on with plants. So here's a picture of an oak tree, okay, and a picture of an acorn at the base of that oak tree. And we know this much, that acorns, if you were to take that acorn and you were to weigh it on a scale, it would have a mass somewhere from 3 to 4 grams. Okay. If you were to cut down the oak tree and weigh that on a scale, it would have a mass of about 8 tons. So we have to ask ourselves, what source of material, or where is the material coming from to increase the matter or increase the mass of that object from an acorn at 3 grams to a tree at 8 tons. Okay. We can look at this a little different, okay, with another example. Let's say we're talking about redwoods. Redwoods are the biggest trees in the world. And if we had 1 million redwood seeds, it would weigh about 8 pounds, or about 3,628 grams. We take one large adult redwood tree, and it weighs about 50,000 pounds, okay, or 25 tons. So you're going from 8 pounds for 1 million seeds. Remember, you can convert that. You just take that 8 pounds and divide it by 1 million, and that's what one redwood seed would weigh. And you take that seed, you plant it in the ground, and 300, 400 years later, okay, sometimes maybe even longer than that, depending on how old the adult is, how mature it is, okay, and that organism weighs 50,000 pounds. Where does the material come from? Well, this brings us to a classic experiment that was done a very long time ago. It's called the Willow tree experiment, where scientists were contemplating this idea of where does the mass of a tree come from? Where do you go from a tiny little teeny seed to a couple years later you have a full-grown tree? Or even if we're just talking about like a vegetable garden, you take a little teeny seed and a couple months later you have a full bush with, tomatoes on it that, far outweighs the original weight of that seed. Where does the material come from? So the initial hypothesis, this is the hypothesis at the time, was that plants grew and obtained mass, okay, by absorbing the material in the soil through their roots. Okay, so here you can see the root zone, okay, and you can see this tree on top, okay, and you can see that the idea was that the material, the nutrients, okay, that were in this soil were being absorbed in the root zone to create all the mass above ground. So, in other words, this hypothesis would mean that you would have a prediction that says the majority of the plant of the plant's mass, the majority of the plant's mass must come from soil nutrients. So you could devise an experiment. Well, None had been attempted until the 17th century. So into the 1600s, no one had ever tested where the mass of a tree comes from until this man. Okay, Jean-Baptiste van Helmont. Okay, you also might see his name as John, Jonah. There's lots of different ways to spell his name, ways to say his name, but he was a chemist, a physiologist, and a physician. Okay? And so he got his medical degree in 1599, and then he got his doctorate in medicine in 1605. Okay, so he was mainly a doctor, physician, but you have to realize at this time in the 1600s, even into the 1700s and 1800s, a lot of physicians on the side, they were doing science. Okay? They're trying to discover new things because, you know, the medical field was not so much medicine, but rather try to stop the bleeding kind of thing, try to remove the rotten tissue or try to reset the bone as best you can. So medicine at this time was not highly technical. And so a lot of individuals who were physicians, they were looking at other ways that the scientific fields or other discoveries that could help with their practice. Well, Jean-Baptiste was also the individual who, through experiments, he founded pneumatic chemistry, or the study of gases, so the chemistry of gases. So Hamilton was thinking about this idea of stuff in the air. Okay? What was the air made out of? Okay? And the role that products in that air played in everyday life. What you were breathing in, maybe what plants were breathing in. Okay? You know, whether or not you could start a fire, whether or not that fire would go out, could you poison yourself with certain things in the air? So he was thinking about the chemistry of air, or chemistry of gases. Okay. He also might have been the very first person to describe how enzymes work. So being a physician and a physiologist, he looked at how intestines and how the stomach lining kind of worked in organisms, and he might have been the first person to describe how an enzyme worked. Now, you know, enzymes and enzyme activity and the actual discovery of enzyme came much later, but the actual process by which they work was written down by Hamilton during this period of time, during his life. But what he's most famous for, unless you're a chemist and you do pneumatic chemistry, what he's most famous for is his classic willow tree experiment. And let's lay that out. Okay, so Jean-Baptiste hypothesized that trees don't gain mass from the soil alone, but also from the air. Okay, and you can realize that this is not a hypothesis. Okay, this is, you know, what has been stated his hypothesis was, but the scientific method and how hypotheses are written today, this wouldn't fly. Okay, because you have these but, alone, also statements in there. A better hypothesis for Hamilton's research would be trees gain mass from absorbing products from the air. Okay? Or absorbing one thing from the air would be better if you have the capability of measuring that. Okay? And another hypothesis would be trees absorb material from the soil, and that is how they gain mass. Or and in turn they gain mass. So you divide it up, have multiple hypotheses. But at any rate, that was his original hypothesis or original explanation. So what he did was he planted a willow tree in a pot of dry soil. Okay, so he took a willow tree, planted it just like that, and he knew how much the willow tree weighed, 2.3 kilograms, and then he knew how much the soil weighed, 90.8 kilograms. So he recorded both masses, and then he waited 5 years. So the experiment took 5 years. The willow tree's mass gained 74.5 kilograms. But the soil only lost 0.06 kilograms of mass. So here this tree grew. It gained 74 kilograms. The soil weighs almost identical to what it did 5 years previously. The old hypothesis of the mass of a tree comes from the nutrients that are absorbed from the soil was rejected. The new hypothesis that the mass of a tree comes from the absorption of chemicals in the air was tentatively accepted. So what makes up the majority of the mass of this item? Remember what Harvard said? 75% water, 15% carbon, 10% said minerals in the soil. The answer? Carbon. Carbon makes the majority of this wood up. And it is species specific, so it depends on the type of wood. Whether it's 35 to 55% of that wood is comprised of carbon. Carbon that comes from the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Water makes up 20 to 25% in a wet piece of wood. Now again, this is average. So some pieces of plant material, woody material, etc., is very good at absorbing water, and it might have a much higher water content. But if this is a dry, completely dry piece of wood, then 0%, or maybe I should say 0 to 2% is water, because maybe you can't get all the water out. But it's so little of this would be water if it's dry. Now, I should state, the Harvard science grads were presented with a dry log. It was completely dry. And 75% said that water made up this organism. 15% said it was carbon. 10% said it was minerals from the soil. Okay. That brings me to a couple other scientists that we need to talk about. Jean Zimber, okay? He was a Swiss botanist, a pastor, a naturalist, and he demonstrated that plants absorb carbon dioxide and release oxygen. And this process is assisted by sunlight. Now this came after the Willow experiment, much later. And you know that carbon dioxide was being absorbed by the plants and oxygen was being released. Now, what I'm going through is a bunch of individuals, bunch of scientists that contributed to the idea of photosynthesis. It wasn't just one. You couldn't just put your finger on one individual, because there are so many parts to the photosynthetic process. We had to discover, first of all, that the mass is not coming from the soil, but it's coming from the air. Well, what's in the air? In this case, Zenberg was saying, well, it's carbon dioxide. That's what's contributing to that mass. Okay? Julius Sachs said, well, what are they doing with that carbon? Why are they taking that carbon in? And he investigated how starches and sugars and how complex carbohydrates were forming in the tissues of plants and how light influenced that, along with a organelle that is called chloroplast, which inside that chloroplast has a molecule called chlorophyll. We'll look at this in a little more detail. So again, they're building on this. This is where I told you, scientists don't do things alone, especially big concepts like photosynthesis. It took a lot of scientists doing little teeny pieces of it to figure out, okay, this is how it works. Okay, next time we're going to talk about matter and energy. Okay, so we're going to put photosynthesis aside for a little bit, and we're going to talk about what does it mean when we talk about matter? What does it mean when we talk about energy?